right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. My name is Brittany Mellinger, and I'm the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And today we are going to be discussing assistance animals on PHRC's Fair Housing Empower Hour program. Before we get started, I want to let you all know that this program is being recorded, and we will send the recording and the slides out to everyone later this week, so you will have all of that information. I'd like to also thank our ASL interpreters as well as our captioner for making this program accessible to everyone that's on the program today. We are working through a couple last-minute technical issues with the captioning, and look forward to getting that resolved soon. Let's see, I do see that someone mentioned in the chat that there's an echo on the sound. Is this any better? Someone could provide a little feedback. Well, if there's a continued issue, please make a comment in the chat, and I will work to make sure that our sound quality is good. Okay, wonderful. Let's get started. So we always like to start our fair housing presentations by centering our discussion around fair housing as a right in Pennsylvania. We know how important housing is to our communities throughout the state, and not just any housing, making sure that safe, affordable, and quality housing, as well as the ability for Pennsylvanians to be able to choose their housing that meets their needs free from discrimination. And that's why we place such a strong focus on this work. All right, I'm going to try to switch my, hopefully that improves the sound quality for this program today. I would like to start by providing an overview of our training goals. So today we are going to start by setting the stage. We are going to start by just providing a really quick overview of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We are going to provide an overview of the fair housing laws, protected classes, and discriminatory practices. And then we're going to dive more specifically into fair housing protections for individuals with disabilities. We'll be talking about reasonable accommodation requests, and as well as some of the complications that can arise around assistance animals and how we can work to resolve these issues together. And perhaps the most important part of this presentation today is we'll be answering your fair housing questions. So I would encourage you to please put any fair housing questions that you have in the chat. Hopefully we'll be able to answer them throughout the program, but we'll also reserve some time at the end for any questions that we are not able to address during the course of the presentation today. So to start off with our agency, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission has a two-part mission. The first one is to enforce our non-discrimination laws in Pennsylvania. That includes the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, as well as the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. So these laws make sure that Pennsylvanians can live, work, and learn free from unlawful discrimination. So if someone believes that they have experienced discrimination, they can contact our agency to file a complaint, and a neutral investigator will look into the situation. But we also, beyond reacting when complaints are filed, we also work to actively promote equal opportunity for all in Pennsylvania. So in the fair housing space, we do a lot of trainings and outreach to make sure that everyone understands their rights as well as their responsibilities. We have our advisory councils that work to spread the word, as well as social justice ambassadors throughout the state. And another initiative that I want to highlight before we move on with the program is our PHRC on the Road Tour. Our executive director, Chad Dion Lassiter, is visiting all 67 counties in the state to host discussions around the issues and concerns that are being faced by our communities. So this month this coming month in August, we'll be in York County, Union County, and Bradford County. And then in September, we're going to be visiting Westmoreland and Dauphin counties. So please keep an eye on our website for any tour stops that might be coming near you. We serve the entire state of Pennsylvania, and we do that through our 3 regional offices. So our Western region is served by our Pittsburgh regional office. Our Central region is served by our Harrisburg regional office. And then in the southeastern corner of the state, that's served by our Philadelphia regional office. These are the offices that answer questions from community members, that take complaints, that investigate those complaints. But we also have staff in our central office that does outreach and administrative functions as well. Here's a brief overview of what our various laws cover. So you can see that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act covers the bulk of our work. It covers employment, it covers housing, commercial property, public accommodations, as well as primary and secondary education up through high school. Our Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act, that covers post-secondary education, such as colleges, trade schools, technical schools, and things like that. Moving on to fair housing, since that's the purpose of our coming together today, we have fair housing laws at the federal, at the state, and at the local level. So at the federal level, there's the Fair Housing Act. There's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act. At the state level, it's the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, which I just mentioned. And then at the local level, there are local ordinances throughout the entire state. So there's over 70 throughout our state. They might be at the city or borough level or at the county level. If you're familiar with the local ordinance that's in your area, please feel free to put that in the chat. I'd love to see if we've got folks here that are familiar with any local ordinances that may provide additional protections beyond what's at the federal and the state level. We will be talking primarily about the federal and the state level today, since that's a jurisdiction, but there are separate protected classes available at the local level that might not be available at the state level, such as source of income, which ensures that people are not turned away from housing opportunities because of their source of lawful income, such as a Section 8 or housing choice voucher, alimony, child support, things like that. So what do our fair housing laws do? Well, they make sure there's no discrimination or unfair treatment in the sale and rental of housing, as well as housing-related transactions. So sometimes we gloss over the housing-related transactions. It's pretty intuitive that when housing is being sold or rented, there's potential for discrimination, but also in these other transactions, such as insurance, appraisals, securing a loan, there's also potential for discriminatory practices and policies that can impact access to housing. So those are also covered under our fair housing laws. Fair housing covers a broad range of types of housing. It includes apartments, single-family homes, mobile home parks, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. And there are two main types of discrimination or discrimination theories that I want to highlight today. So the first one is disparate treatment. So that's what a lot of folks think about if they think about housing discrimination. It's treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. So taking, for example, the protected class of disability, it might be saying, you know, I know you're applying to rent here to this apartment, but I don't think it's safe for you to live here because of your disability. So I'm going to deny your rental application. Someone's experiencing different treatment because of their protected class. Disparate impact, on the other hand, can be a little bit less clear and less obvious. So it's a policy that's neutral on its face, but it has a disproportionate impact on members of a protected class. So looking again at the protected class of disability, it could be a policy that says you need to have full-time employment to be able to rent here. That doesn't mention individuals with disabilities in the policy at all. But when you look at rates of employment between people who have disabilities and those who don't, we know that individuals with disabilities have much lower employment rates. So this policy could have a disproportionate or a disparate impact on individuals that have disabilities. Yes, the Fair Housing Act does cover condos as well. Great question. Thanks for putting that in the chat. All right, and next we're going to move on to protected classes. Before I advance the slide and show you the protected classes, I'd love to see how many we can come up with in the chat as a group. I always like to leverage the wisdom of the group. So I'd encourage anyone to, if you're familiar with any protected classes, any groups of people that have protections against discrimination in housing, to feel free to enter them into the chat. We already spoke about individuals with disabilities. All right, I see Elsa has her hand raised. Elsa, I'm going to allow you to speak if you want to enter, if you want to voice any protected classes, you're welcome to do so.
Sorry, it won't let me type in the chat. It just says chat is only available during the meeting, so I'm not able to participate in the chat for some reason.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Okay, well, if you had any protected classes that you wanted to highlight, feel free to let me know. And my colleague, Caroline Eister, is working on technical difficulties. So we'll see if that's an issue that we can resolve for the chat function, but that could be a reason that others can't enter things as well. That's what I was thinking.
That's why I wanted to ask, mention something in case others were having the same problem. Yeah, I see some thumbs up.
Okay. All right, we'll keep moving on then. And I will go ahead and share the screen and we'll discuss from there. All right, so our protected classes, we've got 7 at the federal level under the Fair Housing Act. And I do apologize for the technical difficulties, and we will make sure that this is running a little smoother next time. So at the federal level, we've got race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. At the state level, you'll see it mirrors that. So race, color, national origin, familial status, religious creed, sex, and disability. But we also add on 3 additional protected classes. So those age 40 and above, there's ancestry, as well as the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. And I do want to provide a little clarification. Sometimes folks ask, well, what's the difference between national origin and ancestry? Aren't they pretty similar? And they are related, but national origin would be the country that you yourself are from, whereas ancestry would refer to your family's ancestry, where your family is from, versus you specifically if you immigrated from another country. I also want to provide a more specific definition of familial status. That includes families with children under the age of 18 who are living with their parents or legal custodians. That includes people who are pregnant, as well as people who are securing custody of children under the age of 18, and foster children included, as well as biological children. I'd like to touch on sex as a protected class under the Human Relations Act. So while you didn't see sexual orientation, gender identity, LGBTQ as a specific protected class under the federal or the state level, we did recently finalize regulations, and those were finalized in August of 2023, that further defines the protected class of sex. And these regulations establish that the term sex may refer to sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, transgender identity, gender transition, gender identity, and or gender expression. So it's a very expansive look at the protected class of sex. And we do utilize these regulations as we accept complaints, conduct investigations, and adjudicate cases. So individuals who believe that they've experienced discriminatory treatment on the basis of their gender identity, their expression, they can file a complaint with our agency, and they can have that investigated under the protected class of sex. And we do have flyers on our website that provide additional detail on that, and we are working diligently on making sure that community members are aware of these protections, so that way anyone who believes that they've experienced unlawful discrimination knows how to address that situation. And then the last protected class that I want to spend some time on is disability, since that's the main thrust of our discussion today. So disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. And some examples of this include caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, or working. So that's not an exhaustive list, but just some examples. And our fair housing laws protect those who have a disability, who has a history of a disability, as well as those who are regarded as having a disability. So this is important because someone may not currently have a disability that substantially limits one or more of their major life activities, but if a housing provider is aware of a previous condition or assumes they have a certain type of disability, could be a mental health condition, an intellectual disability, developmental disability, and treats them discriminatorily because of that, then they can still file a complaint and have that investigated. Now, I do want to highlight a few disability-related exemptions. So these would be folks who would not have disability-related protections. And that includes individuals who are currently using illegal drugs. Now, if someone's in active recovery, they would be under disability-related protection. But folks who are currently using controlled substances or illegal drugs would be exempted. Likewise, individuals who pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others would also be exempt from disability-related protection. And yes, addiction to alcohol would be considered to be a disability if they're in, and they would be covered by disability-related protections if they're in active recovery. All right, we're going to talk about discriminatory actions, and we're going to take a pretty quick tour through these because I would like to spend the bulk of our time on individuals with disabilities. I do see a question in the chat about medical marijuana. Because marijuana is still a federally controlled substance, a housing provider would not be required to make a reasonable accommodation for an individual on the basis of the use of marijuana. All right, so discriminatory actions could include statements for a preference for or against an individual in a protected class. Discriminatory inquiries, so asking if someone's part of a protected class when they're applying to rent housing or to buy a home, get a loan. Steering folks towards certain types of housing, certain neighborhoods, certain floors on the basis of their protected class. Flat out refusing to sell, lease, or finance homes or housing. Conducting an unfair appraisal on the basis of the protected class of the homeowner or the folks who live there. Predatory lending, so providing poor lending products with worse terms, providing less service to neighborhoods that are primarily individuals in protected classes. That would be lending discrimination. Discriminating in housing terms or conditions. So the amount of rent that's being charged, the security deposit, things like that, as well as providing different services and facilities to folks on the basis of protected classes. So enforcing the lease terms unfairly on the basis of protected classes, not allowing children to use the pool or the laundry facilities, things like that. Sexual harassment or harassment on the basis of any protected class is discriminatory. And then lastly, our focus today, which is refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and modifications, which are specific to individuals with disabilities. Individuals with disabilities do have protections against all of the different types of discrimination that are listed on the screen, but reasonable accommodations and modifications are specific to individuals with disabilities. All right, so an individual with a disability has the right to request a reasonable modification or accommodation that they need in order to use and enjoy their housing. So a reasonable modification, that's a structural change that's made to the premises. whereas a reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, a policy, a practice, or a service. I'd like to invite anyone, I hope the chat is working correctly now, and because I do see comments coming through. If you know of any modifications or accommodations, whether it's one that you've made yourself, whether it's one that you've received as a housing provider, please feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat and share that with the group. Has anyone heard of any types of reasonable accommodations or modifications in housing, something that might be needed for an individual with a disability in order to use their housing? Thanks, Brenda. Yes, a ramp is a great example of a reasonable modification. Heidi, grab bars in the bathroom, absolutely. Those are both modifications, changes to the structure, which allow someone with a disability to be able to use and enjoy their housing. Gloria, thanks. A walk-in shower, absolutely. Another modification. All right, and Kathy and Elsa, allowing animals, service animals. Yes, that's a reasonable accommodation. Widened doorways, countertops, absolutely. Absolutely, those are great examples of modifications. So you can see there's a wide range of different things that might be needed based on the needs of the individuals with the disability. I see there's a question, is a parking spot close to the housing unit, does that qualify as a reasonable accommodation? And yes, that can. Sometimes the parking for individuals with disabilities, that parking that's designated, that's not necessarily going to meet the needs of a tenant based on where their housing is, based on their specific needs. So someone may be able to request that change in policy to get some reserved parking that's close to their unit based on their disability related needs. And lighting, absolutely. Thank you so much for all of those comments and that interaction in the chat. So reasonable modifications. It would be discriminatory for a housing provider to refuse to allow a person with disability permission to modify and pay for those changes that enable them to use a facility. So it's the housing provider's responsibility to grant permission, and it's the tenant's responsibility to pay for the changes. Now, an exception to this is if this housing provider receives federal funds. If there are federally supported housing providers, such as a public housing authority, such as a low-income or subsidized housing complex, then they would be required to pay for the modification, not the tenant. I also want to note that a housing provider may require the renter to restore the interior back to the original condition at the end of the tenancy, minus normal wear and tear. And we covered both of the examples in the chat already, grab bars in the bathroom, as well as a ramp. Those are some great examples of modifications. Now, reasonable accommodations are looking at the rules, policies, practices, and services, making those changes that are needed to afford equal opportunity for a person with a disability to use and enjoy their housing accommodation. So some examples of this include allowing a person with a disability who receives disability income to be able to pay their rent on a different date than other tenants. So some individuals receive income specific to their disability, and if they're receiving it later in the month and using that income to pay their rent for the month, they would be incurring extra fees every single month. So a person may be able to submit a reasonable accommodation request to their housing provider, allowing them a different date to pay, so that way they do not incur these fees every month. And then secondly, a housing provider needs to allow a person with a disability to be able to have a service animal, even if there's a no pet policy that's present at the property. So how should a reasonable accommodation request be handled? I first want to note that this request can be made at any point in the tenancy. It can be made as someone is first calling the housing complex, asking questions, as they're touring the complex, as they're signing a lease, as they're moving in. It can be 20 years after they've moved in. And why? Well, someone's disability-related needs can change. So even if they didn't need the accommodation at the beginning, they might need it now. So a housing provider does need to respond to these requests and process them regardless of when they are received. Now, fair housing protections, they allow for these requests to be either made in writing or verbally. We strongly recommend that tenants do make these reasonable accommodation requests in writing. So that way you've got documentation of what you submitted, when you made that request, what the response was. You've got that paper trail that's helpful for both the tenant as well as the housing provider in keeping their records. Now, the request needs to be reasonable and necessary for a tenant to be able to use and enjoy the property. So there needs to be a disability-related need that's associated with that request. It can't just be anything that's wanted. And the housing provider has the responsibility to treat tenants who are making these requests fairly and to respond back in a timely manner. There are often a lot of questions around what type of information can be requested as part of this reasonable accommodation request. So what can a housing provider actually ask for to determine if this is a valid request? The housing provider should focus on establishing the two main criteria. So the first one, does the person who's seeking this accommodation fall under the protected class of disability, which we covered earlier, right? Someone that is impacted in one or more of their major life activities because of their disability. So once that's established, then a housing provider establishes, does this person have a disability-related need for the accommodation that's being requested? So if the answers to both of these criteria are yes, and if the request is reasonable, then what do you think? Should the housing provider grant that request, or should they deny it? And feel free to answer in the chat. Do you think this request should be granted? Grant, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Grant the request. All right, I love it. I love all the interaction in the chat. Thank you all. Now, there can be some documentation that can be requested in certain situations. So if the disability is not observable, the housing provider can ask for proof of need. Now, if the disability is observable, so if it's someone that's in a wheelchair that's asking for a ramp, the disability is observable and the disability-related need is very clear. So there's no need for extra documentation. There's no need to put additional barriers up for individuals that are just trying to get the accommodation or modification needed for their housing. But if the disability isn't observable, then the housing provider does have the right to verify that someone does have a disability and a disability-related need. And that often comes in the form of a medical note of need. Now, this can come from any type of licensed provider that is knowledgeable of that person's condition. It can be from their primary physician, but it doesn't have to be. It can be from their therapist. It can be from their podiatrist. It can be from anyone that would have reasonable knowledge of that person's condition in a professional capacity. Lizzie, I see your comment about jumping through the paperwork hoop for a family and it became complicated. Yeah, unfortunately, there can be complications when getting the paperwork that's requested, but it should be relatively straightforward. I know it can be a challenge to get in for medical appointments and things like that, but I do encourage folks to reach out to their providers that they see on a routine basis and would have knowledge of the condition rather than going to an online letter provider. Now, I do want to note that there are some alternative documentation that can be provided that would establish disability. So that would include a determination of disability from a governmental agency. It would include receipt of disability benefits or services, and it would also include eligibility for housing assistance because of a disability. So the assumption behind this is that another agency has already done due diligence. And the disability was already established, so you wouldn't need to get the additional documentation. Now, as the housing provider is requesting this documentation and verification, I would encourage them to be very cautious and to be mindful of things that they shouldn't be asking. So they may not ask anything about the nature or the severity of the disability. They may not ask questions that lead the tenant to disclose any privileged medical information, and they may not ask to see medical records. Lastly, they can't ask if a tenant is able to live independently. So a housing provider doesn't have any need to know the answers to any of these pieces of information, so they shouldn't be asking, and a tenant does have the right to medical privacy. Now, there could be some potential reasons for denial in some situations. So if the disability is not observable and the documentation isn't provided, then the housing provider could deny the request until that documentation is provided. If that specific request poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others, now this can't be a speculative situation. This has to be something that's documented. And if there's that direct threat, then that could be denied as well. If the request would cause substantial physical damage to the property, that could be a reason for denial, or if it would place an undue burden on the provider. Lastly, if that request would fundamentally alter the nature of the provider's operations, if it would be something completely out of scope for their normal course of work, they could deny that as well. And I do want to note that a simple denial isn't sufficient in this situation. It's then the housing provider's responsibility to go into the interactive process to say, well, I can't provide this reasonable accommodation or modification that you're requesting because of X, Y, or Z. But let's see how we can meet your needs. What alternative might there be that wouldn't cause physical damage to the property? What could we do that wouldn't alter the nature of the operations, that would still meet your needs and be able to have you be able to use and access the housing? All right, Christina, I see a question. Does the live-in aid need to be on the lease? No, because the live-in aid isn't a tenant in the property. The live-in aid as a reasonable accommodation would be an exception to likely a guest policy that would allow that person to be able to use and enjoy the property and have the medical care that they need. And Jamie, I see a question. Would an insurance breed restriction be considered an undue burden? And I will get into that in just a few minutes. That's an excellent question. All right, we've covered kind of the general assistance or reasonable accommodation process and how we go about that documentation. And now I want to go into some more specifics around an assistance animals. Maria, I'd like to take that question about a caregiver at the end of the presentation. All right, and I want to center our discussion around service and support animals under the framework of this being a right. So these animals are incredibly important to individuals with disabilities, providing them really valuable supports. I know there's been a lot of discussion in our culture over the past few years about what assistance animals do, where can they go, how valid is that need? And I think a lot of that is centered around a lack of understanding around mental health conditions and some stigma around that too. Assistance animals that are dogs that are providing mobility support, assistance to someone who's using a wheelchair, that's a very visible thing. But oftentimes the care and support that an assistance animal is providing is a little less visible and a little less understood. But I do want to be clear that under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, it is unlawful to discriminate against individuals who use these animals for disability. And I want to provide a little clarity around the different types of assistance animals. Assistance animals is the umbrella term for service animals as well as support animals. So to start off with service animals, a service animal is generally trained to perform a specific task. A service animal generally supports someone with a physical disability, which may or may not be obvious. In most cases, a service animal is a dog. In some very limited situations, it might be a mini horse instead. And examples of what they can do include pulling a wheelchair, providing mobility support, guiding individuals with vision impairment, as well as detecting and alerting individuals of oncoming seizures. That's not an exhaustive list. It's amazing what these animals can do and the supports that they can provide to individuals with disabilities. If anyone else has examples of different tasks that service animals might do, you can feel free to put those in the chat as well to round out our discussion. And I want to move on to emotional support animals. So emotional support animals, or support animals, or ESAs is the abbreviation. These animals are less likely to have special training, but they still serve a function for the individual with a disability. Now, they can be any type of common household animal. And you can see the picture on the screen there, anything from a dog to a bird to a bunny to a fish, a turtle, anything that's commonly kept in a household. And examples of what they can do include alleviating someone's anxiety, reducing depression, keeping someone calm and making them feel safe. So they're often helping a person manage a condition that we cannot see and is not obvious. Now, I want to highlight that there was some legislation that was passed in 2018 in Pennsylvania. It's called the Assistance and Service Animal Integrity Act. And this was aimed at making sure that folks are not misrepresenting emotional support animals, as well as service animals, as animals that are serving that function. So not passing off a pet as an assistance animal if it legitimately isn't one. So it does establish fines and penalties for folks who do falsely represent that an animal is an assistance animal. And thanks, Susan, for that comment in the chat. Some dogs do alert individuals with diabetes to like a blood sugar drop, and that's a really valuable function. And Jamie introduced identifying visual hallucinations. Excellent, thank you for those examples. Now I want to touch on licensure and certification, since this is something that often comes up as a question. So under fair housing laws, no certification or licensure regarding an animal's status as a support animal is required. An animal does not need to wear a vest or special tag, doesn't need to have any type of ID. And unfortunately, there are a lot of online sites that suggest that individuals need to have these additional products, and they are not needed in a housing setting. So I do want to be clear around that. Some individuals like to have those vests on their animals. It can be helpful when they're out in public to make sure that they're not disturbed while they're working, but these are not needed, especially in a housing setting. Now, a housing provider may require that individuals with animals, whether it's a pet or an emotional support animal, that they follow their state and local regulations, such as requiring licensure or vaccination as applicable. They can also issue violations if an animal's conduct violates the rules of the housing provider. So if the animal is barking loudly day or night and disturbing other tenants, that may violate the noise regulations at the housing complex, and that might need to be addressed if they're acting aggressively to other folks on the premises. That's a safety concern, and that can be addressed through a violation. Thanks, Tracy, for the example of an MS or seizure patient that might get support from an assistance animal. Great example. And lastly, a housing provider can hold a tenant responsible if an animal causes physical damage to the housing unit. So an assistance animal is an extension of the individual with a disability. So if the animal is causing damage beyond normal wear and tear, the person with the disability is responsible to pay for that damage, and that can come out of their security deposit at the end of their tenancy. Now, what a housing provider cannot do is they can't put limits on breeds or impose weight limits on assistance animal requests. So even if the property has these restrictions for pets, they must be waived for assistance animals. So there was a question in the chat earlier about about insurance breed restrictions, and are those considered to be an undue burden? So if you're a housing provider, I would caution you to be very cautious and do due diligence before you would cite insurance policy cost as an undue burden. I would make sure that you document that you've contacted your insurance provider in writing, informing them that this is an reasonable accommodation request that you're seeking to grant to comply with your fair housing obligations, and to document their response to if they would substantially increase your costs or if they would deny you coverage because of this. I would make sure that you shop around for other insurance to see if there are other providers that will give you coverage at a similar rate before you would deny this request. You want to make sure that you've checked all your boxes and do all of your due diligence before making that denial. And a housing provider may not pass along any additional expenses by charging extra fees, rent, or security deposits. A housing provider may charge these fees for pets, but assistance animals are not pets, so you cannot charge them for assistance animals. All right, I see a couple questions in the chat here. So can a housing provider require vaccinations, such as the parvo vaccination for the safety of other animals on the premises? So if this is a vaccination requirement that is in place at the state or the local level, and if it's in line with those requirements, then they can have the assistance animal. They can require that vaccination for the assistance animal. But if it's above and beyond what's required, then that would be putting an additional barrier, likely an additional cost for that individual with a disability. Can you impose minimum ages on assistance animals? I don't think there is any federal or state guidance on that, but I would be very cautious about imposing minimum age requirements for assistance animals, because a lot of the comfort and well-being that can be conveyed from an assistance animal, especially from an emotional support animal who doesn't need specific training, I would not recommend putting any type of age restrictions on assistance animals. I see a question from David about local leash laws and cleanup apply. Yes, absolutely. Assistance animals would need to comply with any local leash laws, and their owners are responsible to clean up after those animals. All right, so if a requested ESA has been reported for dangerous behavior, what kind of documentation can a landlord request to verify that the animal doesn't pose a health and safety concern? Ashley, that's a great question, and that's a little tricky. Typically, the base assumption is that an animal would not cause any type of concern, but if they wanted to deny, the issue should be documented. So if there was an issue around aggressive behavior, around biting and things like that, you would document that. But I think it could be pretty tricky to get documentation that would state that an animal is not a risk. You can follow up with me afterwards if you have additional concerns there. All right, we're going to round out our discussion with some best practices for both housing providers and for tenants. So we're going to start with housing providers. So a housing provider should have an established policy around assistance animals to make sure that all of their employees and staff, as well as their tenants, know what their policy is. Document everything in writing. It's always good to have documentation around any action and communication you've had regarding accommodation and modification requests. You want to limit the information that you're requesting from your tenants to what's absolutely needed to process the request. Shouldn't be asking folks to fill out pages and pages of documentation for a simple request. You should make sure that you're allowing sufficient time for documentation to be submitted and that you're responding back in a timely manner. According to recent HUD guidance, they say within 10 days is considered to be reasonable. And make sure that you're engaging in interactive dialogue to make sure that you're meeting the needs of the tenant. So on the tenant's end, best practices include making the request in writing and keeping a copy of all of the correspondence, so that way you have it for your records. Following up with your housing provider if you don't receive that timely response. Having documentation ready to submit regarding your disability-related need for accommodation modification, that can make this process go so much faster if you get your note and have that available when you're submitting your request. And contacting PHRC, as well as you can contact a local fair housing agency if you believe that you've had your request wrongfully denied. That way you can make sure that your rights are being preserved. And if you contact PHRC, you can file a complaint. So we do recommend talking to your housing provider first to see if you can resolve the issue. If that doesn't work, definitely contact us, our local fair housing agency. We have a fair housing line, and that's 855-866-5718. And that's staffed by our very experienced intake staff, and they can answer questions that you might have. Maybe you don't want to file a complaint right away, but you just have a question. You want to make sure you understand the situation and your rights. Go ahead and call us. We're happy to provide you information. But we are also happy to help you file a complaint if you believe you've experienced discrimination. So we've got our website, a link on the slides, which you'll receive after this presentation. And there's an online form that you can start with, or you can start with a call as well. And you can see our intake number on the screen there, 717-787-4410. We have additional fair housing resources that I want to highlight. We already talked about a fair housing line. And we do also have custom fair housing training and consultations if you're interested. Could be that you want an overview of fair housing rights and responsibilities. We can provide our fair housing fundamentals. Maybe you want to understand about fair housing rights for individuals with involvement in the criminal justice system. We can provide that as well. You want training around hoarding. There's lots of intersections of fair housing with other housing needs and situations. And please reach out to me if you have any questions or would want either in-person or virtual training. But we also have these monthly Fair Housing and Power Hours. It's always the last Wednesday of the month at from 12 to 1 p.m. Our upcoming one is going to be August. I believe that is August 28th. And that one is going to be around fair housing and individuals with criminal records. Our September one is going to be offered by our Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property, Caroline Eister. And thank you, by the way, for providing technical assistance to this session. And she will be speaking on fair housing needs in rural communities. And we'll provide additional topics as we get that scheduled out. If you're looking for written materials such as brochures and fact sheets, we can provide those. And then we have a program on PCN as well. It's called PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. If you want a deep dive on fair housing topics in an interview format, we've got all of those on our YouTube page. And there are some great topics there. All right, so we are at the end of the presentation and we've got a couple minutes for questions. I know there's been some activity in the chat, but I want to make sure that I'm highlighting our contact information here. So that's our central office address if you want to send us the mail, our phone number, as well as my individual contact information. That's my email and my work cell number. So please feel free to reach out if you have questions or experience issues or want to discuss training. Happy to provide any information for you. You see a QR code on the screen as well. Please take out your phone if you're not already on your phone and open the picture app on your camera, and that'll take you to a quick survey. It provides us really, really valuable information on what you found valuable about this training, what you would want us to improve on, and any topics that you'd want to cover you would want us to cover at future sessions, because we're always looking for new ideas on fair housing information that community members are looking for. All right, we've got about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to go back into the chat and see if I can catch any questions that I didn't catch already. All right, I see a question. Will we get a transcript of this meeting? We won't have a transcript, but I will send out the recording, the video recording, as well as the slide deck and some other resources as well. I'm going to share out some HUD guidance on processing assistance animal requests that is really valuable to refer to and answer specific questions. All right, I see a question from Susan. With an ESA, once they're determined, is that something that needs to be renewed annually, or is it for the life of the animal? That is a great question. I would encourage a housing provider not to require an annual renewal, since that's an additional burden, and that's a pretty high frequency. But if an individual has if an individual's needs would change, they should update their housing provider to let them know. All right, I see a question from Elsa. When requesting or providing a medical need note and the disability involves a service or support animal, does the medical note need to mention the need of a service or support animal, dog, cat, mini horse, etc.? I would encourage a medical provider to note the type of assistance animal that's needed, especially if it's specific to that individual's disability, to provide that information that can help the housing provider assess that information. All right. I see there's a question about Section 8. Is it discriminatory? So it depends what area of the state you're in. There's in some areas of the state, there are local source of income protections that would prevent a housing provider from advertising a unit as saying no Section 8. At the state level and the federal level, we don't have a statewide or national source of income protection that would prevent a housing provider from advertising as not accepting Section 8. Lackawanna County. I don't believe there's any source of income protections for Lackawanna at this time. All right, I'm looking back through because I believe there was one additional question I didn't get to. All right, there's a question about a background check for a caregiver. I believe a housing provider would be able to ask a caregiver to undergo a background check, but you should be mindful of any reasonable accommodation requests. Like if there would be something that would come up on their background check that might be disability related, you should be considering any kind of mitigating circumstances around that record, as long as someone doesn't have any offenses on their record that are incredibly recent or severe and relevant to the safety of others on the property. I would encourage you to grant that request to have that caregiver present on the property. All right, I see a question around, do these guidelines apply to an international person here legally with a visa? Yes, anyone that's living in Pennsylvania does have these housing protections. All right, and I said any type of normal household animal can be considered an ESA. If there's an animal that's not typically kept in a household, there should be some justification on why that animal is needed. So HUD's example is a capuchin monkey. So they've got opposable thumbs, and they might be able to be trained. They can be trained to open a pill bottle or grasp things in a way that a common household animal might not be able to do, and to provide that assistance. So if there is an exotic animal or an unusual animal, there should be a little documentation in the note of need that would specify why that specific animal is needed. All right, we are just about at 1 o'clock. I would like to thank you all for your active participation, for your questions, for your comments in the chat. You've been a great audience, and if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. But you'll be getting communication from me shortly with the recording, with the slides. And I'd like to offer one last apology for the communication this morning and the confusion there around when this is going to be held. Thank you for your patience, and thanks for joining us today. I hope you have a great afternoon. Take care, everyone.